In the forest shadows north of Paris, where ancient oaks whisper conspiracies older than the revolution itself, there stands a palace that French history tried to erase, a chateau built and rebuilt across centuries by families who were alternately celebrated and condemned, embraced and executed, crowned and beheaded. And if you approach Château de Chantilly on a morning when mist rises from its moats and wraps around the towers like a shroud, when the reflected image in the water trembles as though the palace itself is uncertain of its own existence, you cannot help but sense that this building guards secrets darker than its opulent facade suggest, that beneath the Renaissance grandeur and the carefully restored salons there lies a history of blood and betrayal, of wealth built on the backs of peasants who starved while aristocrats feasted, of a family, the Condés, cadet branch of the royal Bourbons, who came within a heartbeat of claiming the throne of France and whose palace represented both their soaring ambition and their ultimate failure. And the central question that haunts Chantilly, that echoes through its galleries and gardens, is this: why would the Bourbon dynasty, which produced kings who ruled France for centuries, try so desperately to forget this particular palace, to erase from collective memory a chateau that should have been celebrated as architectural triumph? And the answer reveals truths about power and legitimacy, about the ways ruling families construct their narratives and suppress inconvenient histories, about how buildings become dangerous when they tell stories their owners would prefer remained untold. For Château de Chantilly is not merely a palace but a witness, a stone testament to the brutal realities behind aristocratic privilege, to the violence that secured noble titles, to the exploitation that funded artistic magnificence, and to the way the French Revolution, that cataclysm that sought to destroy the old order entirely, paradoxically preserved this palace by transforming it from symbol of Bourbon power into national patrimony, into public heritage that could be studied and critiqued rather than simply demolished. And to understand how this transformation occurred, how a private palace became public museum, how a monument to noble privilege survived the very revolution that guillotined its owners, we must travel back to the 16th century, to the origins of the Château de Chantilly as we recognize it today. Though the site itself is far older, occupied since medieval times by a fortress that commanded the strategic route north from Paris, but it was in 1560 when de Montmorency, Constable of France and one of the most powerful nobles in the kingdom, commissioned the architect Jean Bolland to transform the medieval castle into a Renaissance palace worthy of his status. And Montmorency, who had served 4 French kings, who had commanded armies and negotiated treaties, who had accumulated wealth and titles and lands across decades of military and political service, wanted a residence that would materialize his power, that would demonstrate through architecture his proximity to the throne, his indispensability to royal authority, and Bolland created for him a chateau that combined military strength with artistic refinement, that featured the classical proportions and decorative vocabulary of the Italian Renaissance while maintaining the defensive moats and towers of medieval fortress architecture. And this hybrid character, simultaneously palace and fortress, artwork and weapon, would define Chantilly throughout its history, would make it uniquely suited to survive the political upheavals that destroyed so many other noble residences. For a palace that looked like a fortress could be defended, could be justified in times of trouble, could claim military necessity rather than pure aristocratic excess. But Montmorency's Chantilly was only the beginning, only the foundation upon which later owners would build ever more elaborate layers of meaning and magnificence. For in 1632 the chateau passed to the Condé family, that cadet branch of the Bourbon dynasty whose members had been granted the title, Prince of the Blood, acknowledging their royal lineage while simultaneously marking their subordination to the main line. And the Condés, particularly Louis II de Bourbon-Condé, known as the Great Condé, would transform Chantilly into something far more significant than a private residence. They would make it a political statement, a declaration in stone and garden. An artwork that they, too, were royal, that they possessed the taste and wealth and power to rival even the king himself. And this rivalry, this constant tension between the Condés' ambition and their constitutional position as subjects rather than sovereigns, would define Chantilly's character and ultimately explain why the Bourbon dynasty tried to forget it. For the Great Condé, military genius who won stunning victories at Rocroi and Lens, who was celebrated as the greatest general of his age, who seemed destined for glory and honor, committed the unforgivable sin of rebellion, joining the Fronde, that aristocratic uprising against royal authority during Louis XIV's minority, and though he was eventually pardoned and restored to favor, his treason was never truly forgotten, never entirely forgiven, and Chantilly became associated in the royal mind with disloyalty, with the dangerous possibility that even princes of the blood might challenge the throne, and so the palace stood as both monument to Condé greatness and reminder of Condé treachery, celebrated and condemned simultaneously, and the great Condé, returning from exile after his pardon, poured his considerable wealth and energy into expanding and beautifying Chantilly, hiring André Le Nôtre, the genius who had designed the gardens at Versailles, to create at Chantilly a landscape of equal magnificence, with vast geometric parterres and reflecting pools and fountains that demonstrated mastery over nature itself. That transformed the forest wilderness into ordered paradise, that proved the Condés could command resources rivaling those of the king, and this competitive display, this architectural one-upmanship, this insistence through gardens and galleries that the Condés were royal in all but name, made Chantilly simultaneously magnificent and threatening, a palace that celebrated Bourbon lineage while also challenging Bourbon supremacy, and Louis XIV, the Sun King who would tolerate no rival, who built Versailles partly to overshadow all other palaces, who required his nobility to attend him at court where they could be watched and controlled, must have viewed Chantilly with profound ambivalence, recognizing its beauty while resenting its implications, acknowledging the Condés' royal blood while suspecting their ultimate loyalty, and this ambivalence, this mixture of pride and suspicion, would be inherited by later Bourbon kings, would become encoded in the dynasty's official memory, would transform Chantilly from celebrated palace into embarrassing reminder of past challenges to royal authority, and the chateau continued to grow and change across the 17th and 18th centuries, each generation of Condés adding new wings and decorations, accumulating vast collections of art and manuscripts and books, transforming the palace into a cultural center where philosophers and artists gathered, where the elite of French society assembled for hunting parties and theatrical performances and elaborate banquets, where the invisible machinery of aristocratic life, the hundreds of servants, the carefully choreographed rituals of precedence and protocol, the vast expenditures required to maintain the illusion of effortless luxury, operated with the precision of clockwork, and yet beneath this glittering surface, beneath the celebrated magnificence and the artistic achievements, lay darker realities that the Condés and their guests preferred to ignore, for the wealth that built Chantilly and maintained its splendor came from somewhere, came from peasants who worked the Condé estates and paid crushing rents, came from feudal dues and taxes that left rural families barely able to survive, came from a system of exploitation so normalized, so accepted as natural and inevitable, that the nobles who benefited from it never questioned whether they had the right to live in palaces while the people who actually produced wealth lived in hovels, and this exploitation, this foundational injustice upon which all aristocratic magnificence rested, would eventually destroy the old order, would fuel the revolutionary rage that sent nobles to the guillotine and burned their chateaux, would transform Chantilly from symbol of Condé glory into target of popular vengeance, for when the revolution came in 1789, when centuries of accumulated resentment finally exploded into violence, when the Third Estate declared itself the true sovereign of France and began dismantling the legal and social structures that had granted nobles their privileges, Château de Chantilly represented everything the revolutionaries hated, symbolized all the injustice they sought to destroy, stood as architectural proof of the parasitic relationship between nobility and peasantry, and the fact that the château survived at all, that it was not burned like so many others, that its artworks were not destroyed, that its structure remained largely intact through the terror and the wars that followed, is both remarkable and revealing, for Chantilly's survival depended on timing and circumstance and the complex evolution of revolutionary ideology, which moved from wanting to destroy all traces of the old order to recognizing that cultural heritage belonged to the nation, that the artworks and buildings created under the aristocracy could be repurposed, could be nationalized and open to the public, could be transformed from private luxuries into collective patrimony, and so Chantilly was confiscated, its Condé owners forced into exile, its contents inventoried and partially dispersed, its functions transformed from private palace to public institution, and for several years it served various revolutionary purposes, housed troops, stored supplies, functioned as prison, and during this period its future remained uncertain, for many revolutionaries still wanted it destroyed, still saw it as symbol of oppression that should be obliterated, but others recognized its artistic and historical value, argued that it should be preserved as National property, as museum that would educate citizens about their history while demonstrating that the wealth once monopolized by nobles now belonged to everyone, and this debate about what to do with confiscated noble properties, about whether to destroy or preserve them, about how revolutionary societies should relate to their own pasts, was never fully resolved, never achieved clear consensus, and so Chantilly survived in a kind of limbo, neither destroyed nor properly maintained. Gradually deteriorating as the Republic and then the Empire had more pressing concerns than the upkeep of former palaces, and it was not until 1815, after Napoleon's final defeat and the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, that Chantilly returned to private ownership, given back to the Condé heir as part of the general restoration of confiscated properties to their original owners or their descendants, but this restoration came with conditions, with the recognition that the old absolute privileges could never be fully recovered, that the revolution, despite the monarchical restoration, had permanently altered French society, and the returning Condés found their palace damaged, their collections dispersed, their world irrevocably changed, and the last Condé prince, Louis-Henri Joseph, died in 1830 without legitimate heirs, and in his will he left Chantilly not to the main Bourbon line, not to the king, but to Henri d'Orléans, Duke of Aumale, son of King Louis Philippe, and this bequest, this passing of the Condé patrimony to the rival Orleans branch of the royal family, represented a final act of defiance, a posthumous rejection of the main Bourbon line, a last assertion of Condé independence and resentment, for even in death the Condés could not forgive, could not forget their subordination, could not entirely reconcile themselves to their position as cadets rather than kings, and the Duke of Aumale, inheriting this magnificent but damaged property, devoted himself to its restoration with an energy and commitment that transformed Chantilly yet again, rebuilt the grand château which had been demolished during the Revolution, filled the palace with art and manuscripts acquired from collections across Europe, created a museum of extraordinary richness, established a library that became one of the most significant in France, and in his will stipulated that Chantilly should pass not to his heirs but to the Institut de France, should become public property, should serve as museum and educational institution in perpetuity, and this gift, made in 1886 and taking effect upon his death in 1897, completed the transformation of Chantilly from private palace to public heritage, from symbol of aristocratic privilege to national treasure, and the Institut de France, accepting this bequest, took on the responsibility of maintaining and interpreting Chantilly, of making it accessible to the public, of telling its complex history. But for many decades this history was told selectively, was presented as story of artistic achievement and architectural magnificence, was focused on the great Condé's military genius and the Duke of Aumale's collecting passion, was about great men and their great deeds, and the darker aspects, the exploitation that funded the grandeur, the human cost of aristocratic privilege, the rebellions and treasons, the complex relationship between the Condés and the Bourbon throne, were softened, simplified, sometimes omitted entirely, for museums, like all institutions, reflect the values and anxieties of their times, and for much of the 20th century there was little appetite for critical examination of France's aristocratic past, little interest in centering narratives around exploitation and injustice, little willingness to ask uncomfortable questions about how palaces were built and maintained, and so visitors to Chantilly walked through rooms restored to their former glory, admired the paintings and furniture and decorative arts, marveled at the scale and beauty of Le Nôtre's gardens, but left without fully understanding the human reality behind the magnificence, without grasping that every artwork represented wealth extracted from people who never saw a painting in their lives, that every ornate room was cleaned and maintained by servants whose names we don't know, that the palace's very existence depended on systems of inequality and exploitation that we now recognize as unjust, and it was only in recent decades, as historians began recovering and amplifying the voices of ordinary people, as museums began to acknowledge their responsibility to tell more complete and honest stories, that Chantilly started to reveal its fuller, messier, more morally complex history, started to examine not just the triumphs of nobles but the labor of servants, not just the glory of princes but the grievances of peasants, not just the beauty of the palace but the price that beauty exacted from those who created it. And this shift in interpretation, this willingness to tell harder truths, has transformed Chantilly from simple celebration of aristocratic culture into something more valuable, a place where we can examine and critique the systems of power that created such palaces, where we can understand the profound inequalities that characterized pre-revolutionary France, where we can see both the genuine cultural achievements of the old regime and the brutal exploitation upon which those achievements rested, and this more honest interpretation makes Chantilly not less valuable but more valuable, not less worth preserving but more worth preserving, for a palace that tells only the fairy tale of aristocratic magnificence is ultimately hollow, is merely aesthetic pleasure divorced from historical understanding, but a palace that reveals the full complexity of its past, that acknowledges both achievement and exploitation, beauty and injustice, becomes a teaching tool of profound importance, becomes a space where we can learn not just about the past but about ourselves, about how we construct narratives of power, about how we justify or critique inequality, about how we relate to inherited structures of privilege, and the question of why the Bourbon dynasty tried to forget Chantilly, why this magnificent palace became an embarrassment rather than a celebration, reveals something crucial about how ruling families managed their narratives, for Chantilly represented everything the Bourbons wanted to project: power, taste, cultural sophistication, connection to French history. But it also represented everything they feared: the possibility of internal challenge, the presence of ambitious cadets, the memory of rebellion and treason, the reminder that royal blood did not automatically guarantee loyalty, that princes might become rivals, that family relationships could deteriorate into political threats, and so Chantilly was never celebrated the way Versailles was celebrated, never became part of the official Bourbon narrative of dynastic glory, never featured prominently in royal propaganda or official histories, instead remained a kind of open secret, acknowledged when necessary but not emphasized, recognized but not promoted, present in the family geography but absent from the family mythology, and this attempted forgetting, this official amnesia, makes Chantilly paradoxically more interesting than palaces that fit comfortably into official narratives, for what ruling families try to forget often reveals more truth than what they choose to remember. And the fact that the Bourbons were uncomfortable with Chantilly, uneasy about its implications, worried about its associations, tells us that the palace represented a challenge to the simplified story they wanted to tell about themselves, and in surviving that attempted erasure, in becoming public heritage despite royal ambivalence, in finding new purposes and meanings in the Republican present, Chantilly has achieved a kind of victory over the dynasty that built it, has outlasted the political order that created it, has become more significant as national museum than it ever was as private palace, and visitors today, walking through rooms restored by the Duke of Aumale, admiring artworks collected across centuries, strolling through Le Nôtre's magnificent gardens, are engaging with history in ways that would have been unthinkable when Chantilly was private property, are claiming cultural heritage that once belonged exclusively to the privileged few, are exercising democratic right of access to beauty and knowledge that aristocracy once monopolized, and this transformation, this opening of closed doors, this making public of private splendor, represents the revolution's lasting victory, demonstrates that political upheaval, however violent and chaotic, permanently altered the relationship between people and power, between citizens and cultural heritage, between the nation and its history, and Chantilly, in becoming public, in serving as museum and library and research center, in opening its doors to millions of visitors who come to learn and admire and critique, fulfills a purpose far more significant than housing princes ever was, becomes a space where we can examine the systems that created such magnificence, where we can appreciate artistic achievement while acknowledging human cost, where we can understand both the splendor and the exploitation, the beauty and the injustice, the achievements and the crimes of the old regime, and this complex understanding, this refusal to simplify or sentimentalize, this insistence on telling the full truth rather than comfortable fables, makes Chantilly valuable in ways its original builders never imagined, makes it a monument not to aristocratic glory but to historical memory, not to the power of princes but to the importance of preservation, not to the triumph of privilege but to the victory of public access, and the palace stands today, its towers reflected in the moats that once protected Condé power, its gardens still maintaining the geometric perfection that Le Nôtre designed, its galleries still housing the artworks that Aumale collected, but transformed utterly in meaning and purpose, no longer symbol of one family's ambition but evidence of an entire society's structure, no longer celebration of privilege but examination of power, no longer private possession but public heritage, and in this transformation there is both loss and gain, melancholy and triumph, for the Condés and their world are gone, the system that created Chantilly has been destroyed. The way of life it represented exists only in historical memory, but the palace itself endures, preserved not because we celebrate what it represented but because we recognize its value as historical witness, as architectural achievement, as cultural heritage that belongs to everyone rather than exclusively to the wealthy, and this endurance, this survival through revolution and restoration, through republican and empire and republic again, through all the political transformations that have swept France since the Revolution, proves that buildings can outlive the purposes for which they were built, can find new meanings. When old meanings become obsolete, can serve democratic values even when created to celebrate aristocratic privilege, and Chantilly, the palace the Bourbons tried to forget, has become through that very forgetting something more memorable, more meaningful, more instructive than simple celebration could ever have made it, has become a monument to the complexity of history, to the need to preserve even uncomfortable heritage, to the importance of telling full truths rather than convenient lies. And the chateau stands in its forest, surrounded by the gardens that still proclaim mastery over nature, housing the collections that still demonstrate aristocratic taste, occupying the land that once supported the Condé estates, but transformed from private palace into public museum, from symbol of privilege into instrument of education, from monument to dynasty into monument to memory. And in this transformation, in this survival through political revolution and social change, in this adaptation from serving princes to serving people, Chantilly teaches its final and perhaps most important lesson, that the most magnificent buildings are those that can change with changing times, that can adapt to serve new purposes while preserving old beauty, that can acknowledge dark pasts while serving bright futures, that can function simultaneously as aesthetic pleasure and historical critique, as celebration of achievement and examination of exploitation, as monument to what was and teaching tool about what should never be again, and the palace that the Bourbons tried to forget has become, precisely because of that attempted forgetting, impossible to forget, has become essential to understanding not just French history but the nature of power itself, the way it creates beauty through exploitation, the way it builds monuments that outlast the political orders that erected them, the way it tries to control narratives and suppress uncomfortable truths, and the way those truths eventually emerge despite all attempts at erasure. And Chantilly stands today as proof that history cannot be permanently suppressed, that buildings tell stories their owners would prefer remain silent, that palaces preserve evidence that ruling families would rather destroy, and that public access to heritage, democratic ownership of culture, critical examination of the past, are victories as significant as any political revolution, transforming not just who owns buildings but what those buildings mean, and in that transformation, in that shift from private monument to public memory, from celebration to critique, from forgetting to remembering, Château de Chantilly achieves its deepest significance, becomes finally not the palace the Bourbons tried to forget but the palace we must remember, must preserve, must study, must understand in all its complexity and contradiction, for it reveals truths about power and privilege, about beauty and exploitation, about the price of magnificence and the cost of glory, truths that remain relevant as long as inequality persists, as long as wealth concentrates, as long as some people live in palaces while others struggle to survive, and the chateau, rising from its moats in the forest north of Paris, stands as permanent reminder that the most honest monuments are those that reveal their own foundations, that acknowledge the labor and suffering that created them, that tell full stories rather than comfortable lies. And that survive not because they celebrate power but because they help us understand it, critique it, and ultimately transcend it. And yet standing before Chantilly today, observing how sunlight plays across its restored facades, how carefully maintained gardens extend in perfect geometric precision toward distant horizons, how tourists stream through gates that once admitted only the most privileged members of French society, we must confront a paradox that haunts all preserved aristocratic palaces. That in saving these buildings we risk sanitizing them, that restoration can become a form of erasure as complete as demolition, that transforming palaces into museums often means polishing away the very evidence of exploitation and injustice that makes them historically important, for when we restore a salon to its 18th-century appearance, when we carefully research and reproduce the original wall coverings and furnishings, when we present rooms as they looked during the Condé's occupation, are we not creating a fantasy? A theatrical set that shows only the beauty and ignores the mechanisms that produced it, and visitors walking through these immaculate spaces, admiring the artworks and the craftsmanship, the proportions and the decorative schemes, rarely encounter the invisible labor that made such magnificence possible, rarely see the servants' quarters where dozens of people lived in cramped conditions so that nobles could enjoy spacious apartments, rarely learn about the specific individuals whose hands actually cleaned these rooms and served these meals and maintained this perfection, for their names have been lost, their lives unrecorded, their existence acknowledged only in the aggregate, as statistical necessities rather than individual humans, and this erasure, this forgetting of the people who actually made aristocratic life possible, represents a continuation of the very systems we claim to be critiquing. For if we preserve palaces but not the stories of the people who built and maintained them, if we celebrate architectural achievement but not the labor that achieved it, if we focus on owners and architects and artistic patrons while ignoring workers and servants and peasants, then we are still telling aristocratic history, still centering the powerful, still allowing the wealthy to control narratives even centuries after their deaths, and Chantilly, like all palace museums, struggles with this fundamental tension between preservation and honesty, between showing the beauty and revealing the cost, between maintaining historical accuracy in physical restoration while achieving moral accuracy in historical interpretation, and the question becomes, how do we preserve these buildings in ways that honor both their aesthetic achievement and their exploitative foundations, that present both the fairy tale and the dark truth, that allow visitors to appreciate beauty while understanding injustice, and some museums have begun attempting this more honest interpretation, creating exhibitions about servants' lives, installing displays about the economics of palace maintenance, producing educational materials that explain how aristocratic wealth was extracted from peasant labor, but these efforts remain peripheral, remain supplementary to the main attraction of touring grand apartments and admiring artworks, and the fundamental experience of visiting Chantilly is still one of aesthetic pleasure rather than political education, is still more about admiring than critiquing, more about celebrating than questioning. And this matters because palaces like Chantilly shape how we think about wealth and power, provide visual templates for what luxury looks like, create aspirational images that influence contemporary attitudes toward inequality, for when we present aristocratic palaces purely as beautiful spaces, when we divorce their splendor from the exploitation that created it, when we allow visitors to fantasize about living in such places without confronting what it meant for those who actually lived in them, both the privileged residents and the exploited workers, we risk romanticizing systems of inequality, making them seem natural, inevitable, even desirable, and this is particularly dangerous in our current moment, in this second Gilded Age when wealth concentration rivals that of pre-revolutionary France, when billionaires build private palaces that echo aristocratic excess, when inequality grows and solidifies and begins to seem permanent. For if we teach through our palace museums that such concentration of wealth and beauty is simply part of human history, is aesthetically magnificent regardless of moral implications, is something to be preserved and admired rather than critiqued and resisted, then we are providing ideological support for contemporary inequality, are suggesting through our presentation of the past that extreme disparities between rich and poor are acceptable, are normal, are even productive of great beauty and culture, and Chantilly, in its carefully restored magnificence, in its presentation as triumph of French artistic heritage, in its emphasis on the great Condé's military genius and the Duke of Aumale's collecting passion, risks becoming an apology for aristocracy, a suggestion that the system that created such beauty was justified by its cultural achievements, that the exploitation was worth it because it produced art and architecture, and this is a dangerous argument, one that sacrifices justice for beauty, that privileges aesthetic achievement over human dignity, that suggests the suffering of many can be justified by the pleasure of few, and we must resist this argument. Even as we preserve the buildings, must insist that appreciation of beauty does not require approval of the systems that created it, that we can acknowledge artistic achievement while condemning social injustice, that preservation of heritage does not mean endorsement of the values that created that heritage, and this more critical, more honest, more morally complex relationship with aristocratic palaces requires constant effort, requires resisting the seductive pull of beauty, requires remembering even when faced with magnificence that this magnificence had a price, and that price was paid by people whose names we don't know, whose lives we can barely reconstruct, whose suffering has been erased as thoroughly as their identities, and if we truly want to honor these forgotten people, if we genuinely want palace museums to serve democratic and egalitarian values, then we must fundamentally reimagine how we present these spaces, must center the stories of workers alongside the stories of owners, must make visible the invisible labor, must reconstruct not just the physical appearance of historical spaces but the social relationships that animated them, must help visitors understand that every beautiful room represents hours of labor, that every elegant meal required extensive preparation by people working in hot kitchens, that every perfectly maintained garden demanded the sweat of numerous gardeners, that every moment of aristocratic leisure depended on working-class labor, and that this dependency was not natural or inevitable but was enforced through legal systems that denied workers' rights, through economic systems that kept them poor, through social systems that marked them as inferior, through violence or threat of violence that maintained the hierarchy, and understanding this, really grasping the human cost of aristocratic beauty, should change how we experience these spaces, should make it impossible to simply enjoy the aesthetic pleasure without acknowledging the exploitation, should create a more complex emotional response that combines appreciation with critique, admiration with anger, recognition of achievement with recognition of injustice, and Chantilly, if it is to serve as genuine education rather than mere entertainment, if it is to function as critical examination rather than nostalgic celebration, must embrace this complexity, must tell these harder stories, must resist the temptation to present only beauty and ignore cost. And the fact that the Bourbons tried to forget this palace, tried to suppress its associations with rebellion and rivalry, with challenges to royal authority and assertions of cadet ambition, makes it particularly well suited to this more honest interpretation, for if Chantilly was already an embarrassment to the dynasty that created it, already a site of uncomfortable truths and suppressed memories, then it has less to lose by embracing full honesty, by acknowledging all the dimensions of its past, by serving as space where we confront rather than avoid the moral complexities of aristocratic culture, and this confrontation is necessary, is urgent, is not merely academic exercise but has real relevance to contemporary political struggles, for the questions Chantilly raises, about how wealth should be distributed, about whether extreme inequality can be justified by cultural achievement, about the relationship between beauty and justice, about who has the right to live in palaces while others live in poverty, are questions we face today, are questions that shape political debates about taxation and regulation, about social welfare and economic justice, about the kind of society we want to create, and if visiting Chantilly helps people think more critically about these questions, if experiencing this preserved aristocratic palace prompts reflection on contemporary inequality, if the beauty and the injustice of the past illuminate the beauty and the injustice of the present, then the chateau serves a purpose far more valuable than aesthetic pleasure or historical education alone, becomes a tool for political consciousness, a space where past and present converse, where historical understanding informs contemporary action, and this is perhaps the highest purpose palace museums can serve, not preservation for its own sake, not beauty divorced from meaning, not celebration of past grandeur, but critical engagement with systems of power that persist in new forms, and Chantilly, the palace the Bourbons tried to forget, becomes in this interpretation the palace we must remember, must study, must understand in all its contradictions, for it reveals that power always tries to control its own narrative, always attempts to suppress uncomfortable truths, always seeks to be remembered as it wishes to be remembered rather than as it actually was, and our responsibility as democratic citizens, as inheritors of heritage we did not create, as visitors to spaces that once excluded people like us, is to resist that control, to insist on full truth, to remember what power wants forgotten, to preserve buildings while critiquing the systems that built them, to appreciate beauty while acknowledging exploitation, to honor artistic achievement while condemning social injustice, and to use these preserved spaces not as escapes from contemporary problems but as lenses through which to examine them, not as fantasy worlds where we can pretend to be aristocrats but as historical evidence that helps us understand why aristocracy needed to be abolished, not as celebrations of the past but as warnings about the present, and Chantilly, standing in its forest with its towers reflected in moats that no longer defend anything, its gardens still geometric but now open to everyone, its galleries filled with artworks accessible to any visitor willing to pay modest admission, represents the partial victory of democratic values over aristocratic privilege, the transformation of exclusive space into inclusive heritage, the repurposing of monuments to inequality into instruments of education, and this transformation is worth celebrating even as we recognize its incompleteness, even as we acknowledge that preservation always involves compromise, that making palaces into museums sanitizes them to some degree, that public access does not automatically produce critical consciousness, that tourism can be as superficial as it is educational, and that the work of honest interpretation, of telling full truths rather than comfortable lies, of centering workers alongside owners in historical narratives, remains perpetually incomplete, perpetually challenged by the seductive power of beauty, by visitors' desire for pleasure rather than critique, by economic pressures to present heritage in ways that attract tourists and generate revenue, by political pressures to celebrate rather than question national history, and yet this work must continue, must be constantly renewed, must be the ongoing project of every generation that inherits these buildings. For if we fail to tell honest stories about palaces like Chantilly, if we allow them to become mere aesthetic objects divorced from social context, if we forget the exploitation and remember only the beauty, then we dishonor both the workers who created the magnificence and the revolutionaries who fought to make it public, and we risk contributing to the normalization of inequality, the acceptance of extreme wealth concentration, the idea that some people deserve palaces while others deserve poverty, and Chantilly, the palace the Bourbons tried to forget, must be remembered not as they wished it remembered, as embarrassing reminder of cadet ambition and internal rivalry, but as we need to remember it, as evidence of how aristocratic systems actually functioned, as testament to both the cultural achievements and the human costs of concentrated wealth and power, as monument to exploitation that created beauty, as palace that survived revolution to serve republic, as private possession transformed into public heritage, as exclusive space made inclusive, as symbol of privilege repurposed as instrument of education, and as perpetual reminder that buildings outlive the political systems that create them, that architecture survives purposes, that palaces can be democratized, that beauty can be liberated from the systems of injustice that produced it, and that our relationship with inherited heritage must always be critical, questioning, willing to appreciate without endorsing, to preserve without celebrating, to remember without romanticizing, and to use the past not as escape from the present but as tool for understanding it, critiquing it, and ultimately transforming it. For if palace museums like Chantilly can help us think more clearly about power and privilege, about wealth and justice, about the relationship between beauty and exploitation, about what kind of society we want to create and what values we want to embody, then they justify their preservation not through aesthetic merit alone but through social utility, not because they are beautiful but because they are useful, not as monuments to what was but as tools for imagining what might be, and Chantilly, rising from its moats in the forest north of Paris, its stones bearing witness to centuries of ambition and exploitation, achievement and injustice, beauty and cost, stands finally as testament to the possibility of transformation, the potential for buildings to change meanings while maintaining forms, the capacity of heritage to serve new purposes while preserving old evidence, and the enduring power of critical memory to resist official forgetting, to insist on full truth, to honor both magnificence and its price, and to remind each generation that palaces, however beautiful, were built by human hands for human purposes, and that we who inherit them have both the right and the responsibility to examine them critically, to question the systems that created them, to appreciate their beauty while condemning their injustice, and to ensure that they serve not the celebration of past privilege but the education of present citizens. Not the glorification of aristocracy but the advancement of democracy, not the romance of inequality but the reality of its costs, and in this way Chantilly, the palace the Bourbons tried to forget, becomes the palace that helps us remember what matters most, that beauty without justice is hollow, that magnificence built on exploitation is tainted, that heritage must be preserved but also questioned, and that the greatest monuments are not those that celebrate power but those that help us understand, critique, and ultimately transcend it.